Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on learning brain science, how the brain works, how the brain learns, how to optimize that process. This is the beginning of a three-part series. It'll be this week. Next week, I'll be talking to you again about preparing for academic challenges and assessments and tests. And finally, I'll be joined in week 3 with John Cadenhead, our head of tutor services, talking about when it comes to testing, when it comes to assessments, how do you perform? How do you optimize performance on test day? So kind of the foundations of learning today. Next week, study skills, your environment, support networks. And then in 2 weeks, it's going to be how do you actually perform on the day of. So we'll take a minute. I see we have some people coming into the room, and I'm going to wait till a few more filter in, and then we'll do a poll, and then we will begin the process. So just take a minute while everyone settles in. Okay. All right, I think we're starting to hit a bit of a plateau here. Why don't we start off? We're doing something we always do. We have a little poll in the beginning. It's 3 questions. It takes all of 40 seconds. Are you a student, a parent, or an educator? If you have a student or are a student, are you as a high school senior, junior, sophomore, freshman, middle school, elementary school? Know our audience. Then if you need any support, test prep, academic tutoring, or EF coaching, and finally, would you like someone to reach out? That's it. And you close it out, and that takes all of half a minute, and then we can go ahead and jump into the content. So today we're going to cover the material, and we'll always have time at the end for Q&A. And hopefully I'll answer a lot of questions, give you some foundations, and this will be hopefully practical for y'all and for your kids. And you'll be able to modify how you support your kids in a few small ways. And also next week and the week after, we'll be building on this. But this is really the foundational talk, getting you some sense of how the brain works and why certain strategies are more effective and why certain ones are less effective, understanding the network nature of our brain and cognition. So let's jump in. So to begin, the brain, it's this giant, beautiful network, and everything, they have these 100 billion, these neurons, and then you have these supporting cells, the glial cells, and all about their connections, connectivity, which is very plastic. It moves, it changes, neurons connect, they wire, they strengthen, if those aren't being used, they rewire. Certain connections get deeply myelinated and canalized. And they have very strong quick signals. Other ones, they're not as rapid, and they often, they shift. So the brain's always moving and changing. You can learn until you die, and you can learn. We're developing new neurons all the time. When we exercise, when we sleep, the brain is rebuilding itself. And so we used to think that if there was damage or lesions to the brain, that was it. Learning's over. But now it's like no. We're watching the brain rebuild, regrow, shift. People who have lesions or paralysis, things shift in the brain, trying to rebuild from damages. So we're always trying to reconnect things that when new data comes in, it wants to hook up somewhere with other data that's relevant with certain schema that light up in the brain. That's kind of the foundation. So we talk about this concept, seminal concept of the Hebbian network, that cells, neurons that fire in sequence together, eventually, they start to wire. And they become more connected the more the sequence happens. The more you see this, do this, stimulus response, this becomes an automatic thing. Whereas instantly, when you begin getting some activation in this neural chain, this thing starts lighting up because these things start working together. Even the expectation of, if you talk about, the word dog, many other things tied to dog begin to kind of vibrate, knowing you can go there any second, and they're faster to hit than things not tied to dog. So the brain is this big, beautiful network. And we talk about synapses and all this, the architecture of the brain, the way it was able to move around. It's not physically wired. You have these little gaps, these spaces between neurons called synapses, and they send these things called neurotransmitters, which these little chemical messengers back and forth. And if, again, they're not moving, they just move to the next one. And they find a new place to land. So it's constantly rewiring and strengthening these connections where there's more neurotransmitters, and we call it more deeply canalized or more deeply wired together, and so forth. So these shift, these change, and neurons are always talking and passing messages back and forth, these calcium chains and so forth. So when you have a sequence of neurons that fire together, this becomes a memory, essentially. This becomes whether a fact or whether it's a sequential memory. A memory is an activation of certain neurons in certain pattern. And the more you strengthen the synapses, it's more likely to happen in the future. Again, a mouse going through a maze and finds a cheese, he'll begin to learn and more quickly go through it. And as these neurons start to fire more quickly, it's learning. That's what learning is, essentially. There are a few regions that are tied to learning. We talk about the prefrontal cortex a lot. That's kind of the foundation of higher order cognition and thinking. We have the cerebral cortex. The cortex is where a lot of our structures are. And then we have this thing, the hippocampus in the midbrain. And it's called the hippocampus, which is it's horse, and campus, it's a seahorse, essentially. And it resembles a seahorse, the hippocampus. And it's critical to memory formation. And we know there are people who have damage to the hippocampus, have a real challenge with generating new memories and encoding them into the cortex. So for long-term retrieval, long-term processing. But the hippocampus, we have evidence that when people are learning, there was some research on taxi drivers in London that after about 5 years of learning and memorizing all the streets in London, they had more density, more thickness in their hippocampus. So this thing, again, can change in your midlife. It can change. The brain changes all the time. So learning is a developmental process. We learn throughout our lives. We're learning before we come out of the uterus. We learn from our first moments, and we learn until the day we die. And information is stored, organized, retrieved, and changed over time. Learning, it's not that we used to have these old ideas that learning things were static or fixed, but things are changing nonstop. So we have sensory data coming to us. Your teacher talks, says something, you see something, you read something, in a podcast, you hear something. It's all coming at you. And then part of it is, what do you attend to? Because there's so much information coming at us, most of it we ignore. If you're walking around a big city or New York, there's things coming at you constantly, but most of it, your brain is programmed to just filter out. It's not important. Unless you see it a lot on a recurrent basis, then your brain's like, oh, this must be important. But typically, without rehearsal or reinforcement, things come in, they hit your brain, and they fade away. The neurons are looking, but it's not going to be a long-term thing. But long-term memory is if your brain decides this thing is actually important, it's valuable for my survival or for my interest or for whatever it is. And certain things, as we review them, we rehearse them, we encode them deeper, and they're going to endure more meaningfully. Additionally, if there's like big emotion, big feelings, big fear, big trauma, these things embed very deeply, even if we see them only one time. We talk about have things being seared into our memory. If there's a lot of emotional activation, or especially fear or threat, the brain's like, oh, never ever forget this. That's part of learning too. So if you're in a high stress, high fear environment, that's going to take up a lot of the energy of learning versus other things in school and so forth. So again, most sensory input, it's very fragile. Most of the memories they don't last. If I asked you what you had for breakfast 12 days ago, you probably don't know. Because without reinforcing, what did you wear 18 days ago? Unless you're Steve Jobs, you're not going to know, because these things, they're not important. And part of the functioning of the brain is forgetting. The brain has to forget to be efficient and fluid and focus on things that are really meaningful. My daughter is now 2, and it's interesting. I know there's a massive neural pruning that takes place when their kids are around 7 years old. And that's why when you ask, a kid will remember, if you ask them at 3 what happened at 2, they'll have it. But if you ask them at 13 what happened when they were 4 or 3 or 2, barring trauma or a few memories, most of it gets washed out. Because again, the brain realizes these things really aren't that important for adulthood. They were important when you were 4 and 5, but the brain has too many connections. And so it prunes away billions and billions of these connections to make the brain more efficient, more effective at firing. So a lot of things just get washed out, things that aren't important. The brain says, I can't have it. Because if too much is in there, too much is active, the brain is very inefficient and it can process more quickly. So the hippocampus helps us figure out what's irrelevant from what's relevant. Things are consolidated into long-term memory networks, and they go from the hippocampus to the cortex, where they stay and they embed. And we have all this new evidence in terms of how things are encoded visually. We have certain neurons which fire when we're in a certain place or with a certain person. There are certain neurons tied, and the brain encodes pretty visually. It's interesting. So Aspects of working memory. You have the central executive in the front, the executive brain. We call it the executive functioning. And that's in the beginning of coordinating things which are going to move and learn. And we have this acoustic loop. How long, can you, if I ask you to memorize a series of digits, most of us can hold between 5 and 9 digits, or 5 and 9 facts or colors or whatever numbers. And 7 is the mean for humans. And that's why, and we it's better and easier for us if we chunk things. That's why phone numbers aren't 7 numbers in a row. It's, 404 dash 253 dash, because it's easier for us to remember little small chunks of numbers than a stream of 10 digits. So we're better when we chunk things. But we have this acoustic verbal loop that can hold about 9 things. 7 to 9, 5 to 9, 7 is the average. Then we have also a holding pattern for images. And the visual cortex is actually a lot more robust than the auditory cortex, the part of the cortex. And the cortex, we used to think that maybe, there are certain discrete differences in morphology, like the visual cortex has different kind of structures of neurons than the auditory. Now we realize it's not the case at all. Cortex is cortex. And people who have a stroke in one area, like things are repurposed and has to move over. So if you have damage to one part of the brain, and then the hearing centers or Broca region, other parts, things just shift and move, and it can move. So the visual part, and people who have early trauma, as babies, infants, their brains can develop very, very, very differently. And so we know cortex is just cortex physiologically. But the visual spatial, we have like 30% of our brain, and for most neurotypical people, is tied to vision. So vision is a huge part of learning, huge part of human experience. We are typically visual. A dog's brain is very different. There's a lot more real estate given to the scent and olfactory processing. Like they smell millions of things, we smell a fraction, but we see so vividly. That's how humans are designed. And then we have this buffer, and that brings together the auditory information and the visual spatial, and then it creates a momentary thing into a long-term memory, integrating vision and sound and these kind of things. There was a question, I think it may be, I missed the first part. Will there be a replay? Yes. So there will be, we're going to send out a copy of this. So whatever you missed in the first 8 or 9 minutes will be available to you to watch within a few days. So thanks for that question. All right. So these are the parts: the phonological loop, the visual sketchpad, and the buffer, which brings them together before they're encoded into the cortex. Pretty cool. That's the, and again, a lot, these are theories, because none of us, we're looking at seeing data. And so Badley and Hitch said, this is our theory, but it's a guiding theory. So there's also this concept of working memory span. And think about, you may have one child who has a really profound memory and one who's not as robust, and maybe, or your spouse or your, and this, it's a little bit easier for people who have a really robust working memory span. And part of, if you ever, have had your kid evaluated or have an IQ test, I was trained in giving the Wechsler in my grad school program. And it's one of the big things is digit span and memory, trying to figure out how much can you hold, because students who can hold more in their working memory, it's easier for them to hold a lot. So if they're doing reading and looking for a thing in the past, they can hold a lot more before they lose it and have to go back to what was the question. And so students who have less robust, a shorter working memory span, tend to employ different learning strategies. They also use more shallow forms of encoding. They repeat more things. And I've seen students of mine do this, trying to learn something, and they just repeat it again and again and again. Like, stop the repeating. Stop that. That's not how you learn something deeply for deep encoding. Let's get you to encode it in a different way versus just you saying it a bunch of times, which is a very weak form of learning. And the much richer encoding is drawing diagrams, making maps, unifying things in a visual spatial way, versus just saying it a bunch of times. So that's probably the weakest way, is by saying it a bunch of times. And we also have some information that working memory span. Students who learn music, music is math. Music is just, tones and vibrations divided up in frequencies, and learning that I'm, 440 hertz, 220 hertz, A to a C sharp. And students who are able to learn, this actually does expand working memory, and which can increase IQ and math ability, the ability to hold more in real time. So math can actually be a benefit, learning how to, hold songs or things in sequence, these intervals. So this is part of learning too. It's pretty cool. Learning systems. There are different distinct parts of memory. We've conceive these as there's semantic memory. I know a thing, I know a certain kind of succulent or cactus, certain kind of food or wine or place, or that's a semantic memory thing. Then there's procedural memory. How do I put a button on? How do I tie a shoe? And there are times people who have, real damage to certain parts of the brain, their semantic memory is really damaged. They can still do things because procedural encodes different parts of the brain than semantic. Then episodic. And this is, again, the memory of time. And when we're learning that things are encoding, there's a researcher, Tversky, I have a slide of hers later, talks about things, we have these grid cells in the brain, and there is a sense of spacing of things that have happened in sequence to help us understand of, what happened when I was 30 versus when I was 20 versus when I was 10. We have these, so episodic has to do with in time. And again, some people are having a real hard time with episodic memory, especially people with, some dementia, some cognitive decline, and they're losing facts and data, but they still can how to do things. They can still pour their coffee in a certain sequence or drive a car, but they can't remember what happened last week in terms of who was I with, where did I have dinner, where did I park my car, things like that. So these are all different parts of the brain system. And one of the coolest things that I blew my mind, I took a class on memory in grad school and learning about memory. And we used to have this interesting idea that, memory is like a VCR or a tape record, I date myself saying that, Betamax, but it was, we have this recording and it's in there. But we've learned now that with this understanding the brain is this network, that nothing is recorded in stone. And every time you activate a memory, you have a series of firings from this nerve, this neuron, that neuron, a series of thousands of neurons are in this sequence. But what's interesting, and it reforms the memory every time you activate it. And so what's so interesting is anytime any part of that memory chain changes, often the memory itself changes. Our memories are not static. Our memories are not as secure as we think they are, and they're always shifting and changing. And the least reliable memories, the ones that are the most unreliable, are the ones that we've accessed the most. The one that's most reliable, a person has a memory, gets to a coma, comes out in 20 years, that memory will be super, super reliable. But someone who's kept pulling up this memory again and again, they keep changing it over time. And that's so interesting to me. And so with one exception also, apart from the coma person, people who have PTSD, people who've experienced real trauma, they have a hard time, like their memories are actually pretty consistent and pretty, they tend not to change as much. And so our repetitive memory from a traumatic event still keeps happening without shifting and changing. But you've heard of rose-colored glasses, things looking back, it starts shifting. When your kids were really small and it was hard, you remember a certain way, but over time, the memory changes because the brain's trying to heal certain things, trying to put down certain things, and things are all shifting and moving. But even there was an idea, are there flashbulb memories? If I remember when Kennedy was shot where I was, or I remember when the Challenger blew up exactly. In our generation, I remember when 9/11, and I can go back. But part of it, we think those memories are special, but they're not. Those memories are as fallible and open to shifting and moving and changing as every other memory. So what I've learned from this, when you're having an argument with your spouse or with your kid and someone says, you said this, or don't be so, embedded to your version of the memory. And I said this, did I say this? Did you say that? I tend to be more forgiving because honestly, our memories aren't as reliable as we hope they were. One of the reasons why eyewitness testimony is nothing nearly as helpful as DNA evidence, that it changes. And one other cool thing in terms of eyewitness testimony, there was Loftus is a massive powerhouse in brain research and memory. And even the way you ask somebody a question changes the memory. So if I show someone a video of a car crash, and then I ask them, how fast was the car going when the glass shattered, when the cars smashed together? And the word smashed together will make them give you a higher estimate than the word how fast were the cars going, when they collided. Someone will say 50 miles per hour with the word smashed versus 35 with the word collided. And then I ask them in a month, and they'll stick with their 50 miles per hour versus 35. So the word smashed forever changes their memory. And it's amazing that suggestion, other things. So memories, just be very kind and gentle because memory changes, not as reliable as we would hope it would be. There is no VCR tape, and it's always shifting and moving. Schema theory. So one interesting thing is that certain parts of the brain light up in these regions. We have a schema. Any of you who saw that movie, Inside Out, that was a Pixar movie, really cool. Like there are certain schema. So we think about the schema of, let's say it's father. And there are all these things that light up together. When the word father is activated, you have all these things that are connected that start to kind of get ready to pop or move. And schema could be loyal, or it could be abusive, it could be loving, whatever it is. There's a whole world around this idea, this construct. And part of it, we have these schema about, let's say it's history or biology, and we have things that are tied to that construct that are in the brain. And so we tack things on, we kind of glob things on to this schema of World War II and what that meant, and so forth. And so prior knowledge really dramatically impacts what comes on, and things are much stickier if there is a prior schema. I throw at someone some calculus and they have no other prior learning, understanding of it, it just bounces off, versus, oh, this is able to filter right here. We have already these billions of neurons that are tied to this math concept. Bam, it pops on and it fits right in. So prior learning is really, really important for what can you intake. The idea of, is there a scaffold already in place to support this new information? And then there's levels of processing that are deeper or shallower. Talk about, there's deep encoding where things lock in and it's going to stay there, and shallow encoding, that's like someone repeating a thing a bunch of times and then they forget it. And deep processing, really, if I do some deep work of making meaning and struggling and thinking, it's going to be a lot better than if I just repeat a phrase 10 times. And it's not about quantity, it's about the quality of processing. It's better for me to spend 5 minutes deeply integrating versus spend 10 minutes just repeating the same thing over and over again. And so so rote memorization, things don't stick, but deep encoding, things stick. There are some factors involved with how much a kid can learn. Cognitive load theory, Van Gerben talks about there are individual factors of the learner. How old are you and your ability? We know that over time with learners, things change with the brain. There's something called crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. If you're a parent, your kids can blow you away at fluid intelligence, typically, in terms of speed, in terms of working memory, processing speed. The young kids, their teens and 20s, they're like lightning. But as we get older, we acquire knowledge, which is called crystallized. At 40, we have the wisdom bump that our kids at 15 or 14 don't have. We have more experiences in other domains. And so the nice thing is, but if you're trying to use, fluid intelligence in your 60s and 70s and try to compete with a 20-year-old, you're going to be in trouble. But the wisdom bump of crystallized, you're going to have more to pull from, more experiences in different domains and different contexts. So you may have different insights than a 20-year-old. So we have the learner, we have the task, how hard it is, we have the environment, and everyone has their own filters. There are certain people, you put them in a noisy room, their learning plummets. Other kids, you put them in a room that's too quiet, there isn't enough stimulation, their learning plummets. Some kids can handle a lot of visual stimuli, some kids can't. So your sensory cup is very specific to you and your brain. And I realize, like for myself, I have a really keen sense of hearing. Things like a ticking clock can really upset me, or a really loud bar. I go into a sports bar and suddenly I have to work so hard to focus on the person in front of me because I'm picking up all this information all around me sensorily. Someone else, they have no problem at all. And so everyone's different in terms of their optimal learning environment. Then we have the other factors of how great is your working memory? Can I hold 50 things or 5 things? Your processing speed, how fast you process, which is also part of IQ. And then the ability to inhibit or ignore irrelevant information distractors. Things coming at you, if someone's crumpling their paper behind me, can I not focus? So everyone's different. And that's why we also have accommodations, we have quiet rooms, things for people, because every brain is different. And one thing I want you to take away from this is there's no good or bad brain, there's just your brain. And you have to, I teach kids executive functioning, and I help them optimize their resources. And part of it is understanding how your brain works and go with that. Don't judge yourself, don't shame yourself. Your sister is this way, your brother's that way, your mom's that way. How do you work? And what do you need? And how do I give you this environment? And part of it, kids who really understand their brains do better than kids who don't. And they do better in high school, they do better in college. So it's really understanding and also at some point having, nurturing, having love for yourself the way you're designed, not wishing you were like somebody else, because that's, your brain is how your brain is. There is a master of learning. I think it was over 120 years ago, an Austrian, or Hermann Ebbinghaus was curious about the brain. Back then, we didn't have people going to PhD school for neuroscience. That really wasn't a thing in the grand scheme. But our notion of the brain was so limited back in the 1800s. But Ebbinghaus said, I'm going to study myself. I'm going to learn how I learn. And what he did, he began using nonsense syllables to train himself and figure out what's the optimal way to learn information that's new. And so we'd have syllables, ka, la, fa, ti, sing 150 nonsense syllables and put them in sequence. And the question is, how many can I remember in a week, in a month, in 2 months? How fast does memory decay? And what he learned is, with one exposure to these nonsense syllables, the decay was very rapid. And within 3 days, he had lost about half of it. But if he went over the material, and then again the next day, then again in 2 days, his retention was dramatically more. In fact, he had 4 intervals of reviewing it. Every time you review something, you're telling your brain this matters. And then when we tell your brain this matters, it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to degrade them. Then these neurons are going to stay connected. And so what he learned is, even if I could spend 3 hours reviewing it one time and put it away, it's not as robust as reviewing it for 15 minutes at a time, 4 days in a row. Because those even if there's more time on that big mass, when I spread it out over days, you keep signaling the brain, this matters, this matters, this matters. The brain's like, I won't forget this. This must be important. So really powerful, this forgetting curve. So if there's something you want to remember for a long time, you want to spread out over multiple days versus one big cram session. That was a big insight from Ebbinghaus. And so again, info decay is pretty quick, but studying it several times, the paired words matched much, much longer. And when you spread the interval out, the strength happens for much longer. So if I spread it out, every day versus every 2 or 3 days, in 4 or 5 days, I can remember it for oftentimes for months, because you're giving yourself these signals. This really matters. Spitzer did some similar research using Ebbinghaus's insights, looking at, if I review it. So the first day, I learned something in textbook. After 1 day, half of it's still there. After 7 days, about a third, 14 days. And then after, 60 days, I only have less than a fifth of what I remember. And that's part of the summer melt. Think about how much you forget. When you cram in, for your AP bio test, you get your 4 or 5. 3 months later, it's like, what the heck did I learn? Unless you really did some deep encoding. But when you cram especially, you're prone to this kind of degradation, which is why I like the European system, when they have the baccalaureate, where you have to, recall stuff from 3 years of material. It's very different than the quick one and done, spit it out and forget it, the model of often US education. Memorize it, cram it, forget it, which then that's, even if you ask what I learned in college, I've lost we've all lost so much. In learning, we've learned that there are certain formats where learning is stickier. And one of the things interesting about our brains is humans told stories for tens of thousands of years, long before we had written language. We are designed to hold narratives. And the human brain loves stories. You give someone a bunch of random facts, we're going to impose meaning and impose a narrative on it, even if things are totally random. The human brain doesn't love randomness. We like stories. And so when you put something in a story arc and that's interlinked and connected, the brain has a better time retrieving that. And so that's part of it, stories and so forth. So the things that are meaningful and important for learning, we know that so much of self-care is tied to how we learn. Sleep and learning. Sleep, we know so much more about it. I have a book, Why We Sleep. And in terms of memory consolidation, cleaning out inflammatory particles, molecules. And at night, the hippocampus goes on rapid cycle. And if you saw a pattern during the course of the day, at night it'll go hundreds of times, and then it'll embed that and link it up to part of the cortex. So at night is when we learn. And if you disrupt someone's sleep, you are destroying their ability to transfer things from short-term to long-term memory. And that's why, like if you're doing the night shift or moving it around, if you're changing shifts, your memory goes to hell in a handbasket. You want to have reliable sleep at a certain time of day, and that's consistent if you want to actually retrieve things later. So this is more the same. The hippocampus and during REM, transform memories are stabilized, consolidated, and these memories are changed, improved, reorganized, so they're more coherent, and you block them away, and then they're in long-term memory, long-term potentiation. And one of the theories of sleep, the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, it allows the weakening of some synapses that help us prune away things that aren't important and clear the slate and focus for what's really, really important. So forgetting what's irrelevant is essential for learning and for a brain that functions well. We know that naps can be super helpful if you want to preserve information. If I do an hour and a half studying, and then I do a little 20, 30-minute meditation or take a nap, that's almost as good as falling asleep for locking things into long-term memory. And so there's less interference, less things come in crammed. The brain also can only handle so much at one time. And if I put in too much, the later stages begin to interfere with the earlier stages. So the brain needs breaks. It needs to replenish its glucose stores. It needs time off for the synapses to refill neurotransmitters. If I keep pushing, I begin degrading what I learned before. So the brain can't go for that long. That's why long sessions are really not very helpful. Interference breaks are important. And so this is part of it. We have limits, and later information can squeeze out other. It's kind of like the Homer Simpson, this squeezes out that. There's competition. And so sleep and having less cognitive activity after a study session can help you not squeeze out things you learned. And then serial effects, there are two things. There's primacy and recency, that the brain, if I learned for an hour and a half, or if I play a series, let's say I play like a series of podcasts, whatever it is, the first one I heard will stick with me some more, and the last one I heard, those primacy and recency are how the brain really sticks. And the middle, you lose more of the middle. And there's some really interesting research. Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky did research, they won the Nobel Prize, looking at memory, how memory works. And Kahneman was curious about like surgery and how what happens at the very end of surgery is more important. If I have a lot of pain at the end or a good experience at the end, it colors my experience of the entire thing. Even if on average I'm at a 7, if at the very end I experience a 2 or 3, I'm going to go back remembering, oh, that wasn't that bad. Versus if it was at a 3 and at the end something very painful happens, I'm going to have a memory of this is a very painful experience. And so the brain, remember, we recall what's at the very beginning and the very end with a lot more salience in the middle. It's part of an interesting phenomenon how the brain works. And so there's some things that are taught in the morning, like at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, are often less likely to be remembered than those towards the very end. And so last thing the kid says at the end of the day, it's going to be recalled. There's less retroactive interference. Interesting. All right, so interference builds up during the day. And so that's why someone talking for an hour and a half, it's versus giving you 15-minute little slices and a little break, and a little slice and a break. So we get overloaded. So we need little breaks. We need something like chunking. And you want to chunk and then and then check yourself. And you don't want to go ever for like an hour and a half learning without stopping, testing yourself, going into the next one. Those little breaks are really helpful. And then there's something, the similarity principle, that when I change topics, there's less interference. And so that what that means is it's better for me to do an hour of chemistry than an hour of math than an hour of history versus let me do 3 hours of chemistry, because the brain can only hold so much in one topic area. Certain neurons keep firing in certain sequences, and I use different parts of the brain when I shift from chemistry to history. So when I'm studying, I want people never to spend like 3 hours doing a topic. Do an hour, then change into your algebra, then change and take a little break, come back to your history. It's better when you're reviewing to shake it up like that. Restoring your attention, taking a walk outside, clearing your mind helps things rest and relax, and helps you encode better. Even looking at nature has some beneficial effects, looking at a picture of nature or screensaver versus keep learning or doing other cognitively intensive things. And there's also interesting finding that part of the relaxing reason, like looking at a forest or looking at the ocean, there's a diffusion, like you don't focus on one point, and that helps the brain relax, helps you feel more calm. And so nature is very soothing for us and helps us with learning and helps us with our emotional regulation. We do know that for many people, too much stimulation, visually, auditorily, too many smells, some people, it overwhelms and clutters. So simple, cleaner environments work for most people. Exercise is really, really good. We do actually grow new synapses and new connections develop when we're exercising with cardiovascular exercise. It's also good for the body. It's good for everything. It lowers stress hormones, increases serotonin, endorphin, all this good stuff. So exercise and learning are amazingly important. We have some evidence that it's nice that when you change context. I mentioned before that the brain's trying to figure out what's important. What's irrelevant? What should I forget? And if I'm walking by the subway, I see a thing, I don't see it again, my brain forgets it. If I see material again and again and again, my brain starts saying this must be important. And that's something that certain politicians understand that, and they repeat, 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 repeat. And the brain, if the brain hears it enough, sees it enough, it thinks it's true. That's something that Orwell knew as well. But if I see something a bunch of times, the brain starts picking up, this must be important. And then you even forget this, the source of it. If you hear it 10 times, your brain starts to forget where it heard it, but it becomes like a little fact in your brain. So if I learn something in the library, and then I learn something in my room, then I learn something at study hall, and I keep reinforcing the same information, my brain's like, oh, it's encoding clues of the place as well as the semantic information. And if I have a lot of spatial cues, the brain's like, oh, this matters everywhere. This must be more important. Let me recall this more easily. So that's pretty interesting. A few other things for learning. We know that if you want to learn something, it's way, way better that you construct information. Three-dimensional drawings, tables, grids, graphs. Don't just write sentences out, but drawing maps, like visual information is held better in the brain than the semantic sentences in sequence. Diagrams, linking things, whether it's history or English ideas or science ideas or STEM ideas, very powerful. We want to relate things to each other, integrating, making, organizing things by comparing and contrasting things, how similar, how different, relating. This is all ways of making the same thing with making things tied to the real world. When you have math that's just abstracted out, here's some letters, numbers, and the sequence of symbols, versus tying it to a real life application, you have a much better chance of understanding it and encoding it for later if it's tied to real world applications. And then it's always better when you generate versus passively receive. Adding a little, when you practice, you make stuff, you draw something versus I'm just reading notes again and again. The notes reading or the saying it again and again is not as helpful if I'm constructing. And we do know that wiring together, that's what. All right. So we talked about spacing practice, like going over time, like what Ebbinghaus did and Spitzer. You're better off going through material in a very deep way than in a very shallow way. We talked about that. There's this concept of the self-regulated learner, which is more and more in vogue these days, because like during the pandemic, and if you do online learning, there's more on you to manage your studying, to manage your learning, to understand yourself, your motivation, your distractions, and so forth, whereby you become a master of your own learning. And part of my work as a coach of executive functioning is helping kids understand how to become better learners that don't need me when they go on to the next year or go to college. They really understand how they learn. And there are many parts of this: metacognition, understanding your own brain, having goal orientation, time management. These are also these are correlated with executive functioning as well. And kids tend to understand how they learn. They choose environments that are going to be better for them. They choose how much help they need. They have targets, what they're going for. They monitor their own learning. They adjust. These self-directed learners. And then the idea of metacognition, it's understanding your own brain, understanding I'm not getting this. That's kids who really do well are the ones who understand their own thinking. And so I ask lots of questions of my kids of what's working, what's not working, what's helping you, what are you struggling with. They're going to think more about their own cognition. They begin to understand what's happening under the hood with their memory, with their learning. I'm having a hard time with the Spanish. I'm doing well in this. And let's say, what are you using and why? And then, so it's really helping you. Like, it's time for a break, or I need help. Let me change strategies. And so students who are more advanced become more metacognitively advanced as they go through. And hopefully adults are better and better at this as our frontal cortex gets more developed. And you want to make adjustments. If memorizing is not working, let me try something else. Let me try an outline. Let me put this book away. I can't read it right now. Let me try it later. Versus just keep hitting your head against the wall if you're stuck. And then there are different strategies. And actually, I'll probably cover this more next week. I'm going to skip this slide right now. A few other slides I'm going to throw in terms of, students who do well with learning. The one frame of motivation is DC and Ryan out of Rochester in Maryland. They say every student has a basic inborn need to feel competent, for some autonomy and for some relationship with others. And so one of the big things is kids who do better off with learning, they have some degree of choice in terms of where they study, how they study, what music they play, what they study first. Whenever I want to motivate kids, I try to give them some choice in how they learn, where they learn, and with whom they learn. Lev Vygotsky, important thinker and psychologist, talked about when you're working with kids, let them go on the very, very edge when they begin to struggle before you jump in. Like, don't jump in too soon. Let them have that mastery until things are about to fall apart, and then you jump in, giving them as much space and autonomy as is possible. A few other points I want to hit on, talking about learning and brain science, learning styles. There was some research, Rita and Kenneth done in the 60s. They looked at how students learn, and they found that there are preferences. And so this is a kind of, and this is not the learning styles that got big into the 2000s, but they were looking at the environment, looking at the, the emotional preferences, the psychological preferences, the physical, the body preferences. And they found that, yes, students had preferences. Some of them wanted to move around. Some of them wanted to fidget. Some of them were better in the morning for a certain context, some better in the evenings. Some liked, and on these things affected outcomes. And so when you attend to so these are the genuine learning styles. So it's a learning preference. I like to learn in a social context with, kids around me. I like to learn in the quiet of a room. I like music on. I don't. I like to be able to fidget a little bit. I don't. I like it a little cooler. I like it a little bit hotter. I like doing my French later in the day. I like doing my math early. These are learning styles that have validity and have some backup, some support. However, the more modern idea of learning styles has been debunked left and right and center. It came from, like, Howard Gardner talked about multiple intelligences. That was an idea which is not borne out by any science, but it sold some books. And he went to Harvard, so people took him very seriously. That there are different intelligences, there are different learning styles. But ultimately, neuroscientifically, it falls to pieces. It doesn't have any bearing in actual research. When it comes down to it, everyone's a visual learner. Everyone's an auditory learner. Everyone is a kinesthetic learner. We have some preferences, but some say I can't learn in this format. That isn't. It's not true. One of my colleagues, Josh Cuevas, who got our doctorates together, he is a cognitive psychologist, and he looked into dual encoding and how dual coding is a better way to frame things than looking at I have a learning style. And he said that ultimately I prefer visual, I prefer kinesthetic, I prefer auditory. It doesn't really matter if I match a person with their stated preference. There's not better retention, there's not better performance if I match a auditory learner with an auditory style of teacher, or a visual learner, and back and forth. However, when people are given information in a visual format and framework, almost all of them show better retention in the visual condition than in the purely I heard it condition. That's really important because the brain does, we have a visual cortex in the back, auditory processing, Broca, Wernicke's regions. So they're using different pathways. And the idea is, and the visual cortex is much more robust, it's bigger, it's more active than the auditory. And humans are just built for vision. We're geared towards vision. There's dramatically more, neurons tied to vision than to touch or hearing. We know that. And so visual cortex is best. However, if you add visual plus auditory, I hear it and I see it, that is better than visual alone. So that's dual coding because the brain can handle more. It's called bimodal processing. It's super additive. I can hear something and see something, and together I have more retained than if I just saw or just heard it, which makes sense. So you want to present things with multiple modalities, visual, movement, spatial. That's better than just any one. But someone says, I'm only a visual learner, I'm auditory. That isn't anything. That's not research. So again, it's like a diffusion of the cognitive load to the visual part, the auditory cortex, and so forth. Imagery and language used together. There's less activation of the language centers than when you just use one source. Okay. Now, Barbara Tursky, she's fabulous, and has spent decades at Stanford looking into spatial memory, spatial encoding, and how the brain works in spatially, how even language is somewhat spatial. And when you encode things, when you practice things using a structured visual organized spatial way versus just sentences, you retain it better. Whether it's English, whether it's concept maps, whether it's science, or you always want to use visual representation, graphic organizers. Things that are visual are better than just writing out sentences. She has a lot of great research. All right. And then there's also a big learning myth on brain science. Whenever someone says I'm a left brain or right brain, like I think an angel loses its wings. Whenever someone says that's been so profoundly, thoroughly, utterly debunked. And there's not, if I look at a math equation, about 13 parts of my brain light up, like 6 on the left, 7 on the right, as I'm decoding the information, as I'm processing, accessing prior memories, I'm looking at the symbols, the whole brain lights up. There's definitely a pattern. There's definitely a brain signature of activation looking at math versus hearing a foreign language. But to say that the language is left and math, math is left, my drawing is on the right, it's nonsense. When I'm doing drawing, there are certain parts of measurement, the brain's lighting up, and definitely a pattern, but not left and right. That isn't a thing. And I did a whole talk on neuromyths. This is a major one. So just so you know that. In terms of this research, I'll review some of this next week too. Things that really help you learn. And when we know that when you summarize something, when you do highlighting or underlining, when I reread something, it's not that helpful. Versus when I generate or when I test myself, when I spread things out, it has a much greater effect on my retention and my ultimate understanding of things. So we'll talk a lot more next week about practice testing and why it matters and how it works as a memory strengthener. And also I talked today about distributing practice. That was mostly Ebbinghaus, spreading it out over time. And testing, it's a powerful intervention, and not standardized testing, but testing yourself, forcing yourself to retrieve information from memory locks it deeper and deeper in memory, because you're asking, every time you activate a memory, an informational channel, you're telling it this matters. So by self-testing yourself, asking yourself to retrieve it, it's even more deeply, oh, this must really matter. You're asking me to recall this versus me just passively reading things. So testing really matters. And there's a little bit of research, Rodiger and Karpicki, I can show you reams of this stuff, of different groups who are reading, trying to learn a passage. One group spends 20 minutes just studying it. One group spends 5 minutes studying the passage, reading it, but then they test themselves over 3 discrete intervals, the same amount of time. They give themselves 0 feedback during the test or after the test. So they've only seen the passage 5 minutes versus 20 minutes. Who do you think had a better retention down the road? 5 minutes afterwards, the ones who just saw it for 20 minutes have a better retention. When I wait a week, people who saw it for 5 minutes do a lot better than those for 20 minutes, because those for 5 minutes had all those retrieval events, having to ask and retrieve and recall it. So testing yourself is powerhouse. We'll talk more about that. And there are many ways of testing yourself, self-quizzing, flashcards, using Quizlets, but you always want to be testing yourself if you want, versus just passively reviewing information. Then we talk about this, is it better to block practice or spread it out? By now you probably know the answer, that those who break it up into smaller segments and mix it up, a little physics, a little chemistry, math, back to physics, back to chemistry, those people do better. So the people immediately when you're practicing it, if I ask you questions, those of you who are doing a big block, a 3-hour block of bio or history, know it a lot more in the moment. When I test them a week later, the kids who mixed it up and did an hour of chemistry, biophysics, they have a lot, 3x better retention. So blocking, masking study, super ineffective. Then there's a question, I'll talk more about this next week, of desirable difficulty. Should learning be easy or more challenging? And learning should have struggle. There should be errors. You want errorful learning. That's why testing is so important, to see, do I know it? Do I not know it? You have to have some frustration. And if I'm just reading notes again and again, or reading a chapter without doing any work with it or interacting with it, I'm not learning very much. So errorless learning is incredibly ineffective, although it feels good. Making mistakes doesn't feel as good, but just reading the chapter again feels good, but it's not very effective. And there's all this research. Dunlowski is one of the giants in the field. If it's too easy, like if I'm just highlighting, I'm not learning. If I'm just underlining, I'm not learning. It may be helpful if I go back and look at something later on, but I haven't learned it anymore because I highlighted or underlined it. I have to be struggling with it and making mistakes. You want to have, that's where testing and there's a phrase here, productive failure is essential for retention and transfer of information. You have to fail in order to learn long-term. When kids are learning, I want a clear division of work and play. I don't want kids, like when they're studying, I'll talk more about this next week, how to study, but you want clear divisions. I'm working and I'm playing versus kids who mix it up. Everything gets worse. They have more shallow encoding. If they have Instagram open, they have Snapchat open, they're doing gaming while they're learning, everything suffers. Interruption, task switching into grades, accuracy, efficiency, and long-term memory. None of us are really very good at multitasking, except for like 3 out of 100. And so every interruption, it takes us minutes to get back to where we were before. So that's why I really want clear divisions. Breaks are lovely. By now, I hope you've learned that. And also knowing your body rhythm. Some people are really sharp and really on in the morning. That was part of Dun & Dun's research. Some people are really great in the evening. So knowing yourself, knowing I'm better after I play basketball, I'm better after a run, I'm better after I take a half an hour nap. Knowing your body, knowing your biorhythm. And also learning what works for you. I mentioned before, learning your brain. Learning, are you better at listening? You have a preference for it, then do more, find more podcasts or things, other tools. Are you better playing music? Does it help you block out distractions? Then play it. Whatever you need. I have kids I work with who throw a ball against the wall. Perfect. Whatever, if trying to inhibit that impulse to move is going to take up your cognitive capacity, then just bounce the ball, but don't without distracting people around you. Find a way that you can fidget without hurting others. Encourage your kids to become interested in what works for them, how they learn, how to optimize their learning. They're going to be better off if they understand what they're good at than if they only know what they're bad at. Talk about breaks. Moving breaks are better. I talk about exercising, moving, walking, stretching. They help the glucose replenish in the brain. The brain runs on glucose, but it gets depleted. And having some sugar, some glucose while you're learning is really powerful. I've learned this when I'm doing like home. I'm building a house. If I'm looking at swatches of fabric or things, my brain gets overwhelmed with some sugar. I can recharge. And the final piece, I'll talk more about this later, but the frontal cortex, the executive functions of the brain, they develop later in life for kids. It's part of learning. It's part of the grand master of orchestrating the learning. This keeps growing until you're at early mid-20s. So you should be getting better at learning, time management, self-monitoring, inhibition of distraction, prioritization from 15 to 18 to 23 to 25. Often when kids taking a gap year come back stronger because their brains just keep developing. And that's undergirding this is working memory, self-control, and so forth. And there is, if you're curious about the executive functioning, we do a lot of work with kids all the time. There's a quiz, learn.applerouth.com/EF-skills-quiz. All right, a few things about Applerouth before we go on. Applerouth, human connection meets science of learning. That's where we live. We do 3 things. We help kids with academic tutoring, test preparation, and we help kids coach them on optimizing their executive functioning, doing better in school and beyond. We have 2 more webinars coming up. We just did Brain Science 101, how learning works. Next up, that's going to be study skills. And then finally, your moment of brilliance, how to show what you know. So these are coming up in the next couple of weeks. We also have, for testing, a PSAT prep rally. We're getting kids ready. We're giving out free practice tests for thousands of kids all over the country. And you can sign up at applerouth.com/prep rally. And finally, we're doing a back to school sale. If kids need any help with chemistry or physics or math or French or writing skills, we have $100 off, applerouth.com/academic. All right, those are all our things. Now, let me shift gears and take any remaining questions. And if there are none, that's okay too. All right, so, and it may be that you have questions later, but otherwise, I'm going to be back for our next, we have 2 more lectures about preparing, studying, and then there'll be a lecture about, oh, here's one. Can you give me an example of how you use images in drawing? And this is deep, it's called deep encoding versus shallow encoding. And part of it is visually, like making tables. Even if there's information, having linking things together using concept maps, whether it's, historical, like this led to this, or even like when you're writing, like starring, like, this is really important, helping you create some kind of hierarchy. So when I'm taking notes, this part's really, really meaningful. Don't forget this. If I'm drawing on it, working on it, integrating it versus writing sentences out. And sometimes I do a left and a right side divided notes, and versus just, long form. And if there's ever any way for you to either prioritize or have a hierarchy of that level of importance, or having connections between characters or dates or like scientific things, this leads to this. Yeah. And so when you're actually taking notes at a lecture or after when studying your notes, yes, when you're taking notes, I want you to be creating hierarchy. I want you to like make some connections while you're, and also afterwards when studying it, link things up. Oh yeah, this is similar to that. This concept here, and this is more important. This is the primary. So both while taking notes, if there's a moment to stop and star something, asterisk, and then afterwards when you're reviewing them, always be working on your notes, reviewing them, marking them up, trying to learn from them. That's pretty helpful. I haven't received any recorded videos. How do I get them via email? So if you wouldn't mind, Albert, if you could respond to this person, and if they're not getting the videos, let's make sure and also, if Albert can't get this one, info at Applerouth. If there's a video you missed, we'll make sure you get these because we do send them out. I don't know why they aren't getting them. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Anything else before we call it a night? Oh, anytime. All right, y'all. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you at the next talk. If you have any needs academically for your kids, we're here and happy to help and work with you. Everybody, have a great night.